In the spring of 1861, a 39-year-old leather tanner from Galena, Illinois, walked into a military recruiting office and asked for a job. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. He was not the man anyone would have chosen to save the Union. The Union had plenty of generals that year. Men with prestigious military educations, men from important families, men who looked the part, who dressed the part, who had the confidence of the establishment. Grant had none of those things. He was given command of a single regiment of 60 Darfenaten Rex 130 untrained volunteers. His first assignment was to march them north from Illinois. A soldier who saw him arrive at the camp would later write, "He don't look as if he knew enough to find cows if you gave him hay." By 1865, that same man would unconditionally surrender to him. This is the story of how a man everyone dismissed became the general that terrified the Confederacy, not through brilliance on parade, not through prestigious credentials, but through something far more dangerous, a complete refusal to stop fighting until the enemy surrendered. Ulysses Simpson Grant attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, the best military school in America, the institution that produced the nation's greatest generals. He graduated in the middle of his class, unmemorable, average. In the Mexican-American War, Grant proved he could fight. He was brave, even reckless at times, but he was also unimpressed with the war itself. In his memoirs, he would later write that he believed it was an unjust conflict, fought for the wrong reasons. He saw men dying for a cause he didn't believe in. In 1854, Grant resigned from the army. He was done. He didn't believe in the military life. He didn't believe in war. He wanted out. What happened next is almost comic in its failure. Grant tried business. In California, during the gold rush, when fortunes were being made on all sides, Grant managed to fail. He was a terrible businessman. He lost money. He made bad decisions. He fell into debt. By 1860, Ulysses S. Grant was working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. This is where the future general of the Union armies was when the Civil War began, behind a counter, selling leather goods apparently destined to be forgotten by history. When the war came, Grant didn't wait to be conscripted. He didn't wait for a commission. He walked into a recruiting office and asked to help train volunteers. At first, nobody wanted him. The political general's men with connections, with influence, with important names got the good assignments. Grant got the undisciplined rabble. He was given the 21st Illinois Infantry, a unit so chaotic that soldiers were routinely drunk, disobedient, and dangerous to themselves and each other. His task was simple: turn them into soldiers. What Grant did in the next few weeks was remarkable. He instituted discipline. Strict, unforgiving discipline. He ordered that no one could leave camp without a pass. He punished deserters. He held daily drills. He was fair. He never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, but he was also absolutely unbending. Within weeks, the 21st Illinois went from a mob of rowdy volunteers to a functioning military unit. Grant was promoted to colonel. It was recognition of what he had done, but it was also a test. Would he be able to command at higher levels? His new assignment was strategic: command the District of Cairo, a position on the Mississippi River. The river was vital to the Union's strategy. It was the highway through the South, and whoever controlled it controlled the war in the West. But Grant's early movements in Cairo were modest, cautious. He was still the man nobody expected anything from. That changed when he met the enemy. In the fall of 1861, Grant led his first expedition into the field. He was pursuing a Confederate colonel named Thomas Harris, who was operating in northern Missouri. Grant had never fought a real battle. He had never commanded men under fire. As he approached the area where he expected to find the Confederate forces, his heart began racing. In his memoirs, Grant later recorded this moment with remarkable honesty. He wrote, As we approached the brow of the hill from which it was expected we could see Harris's camp and possibly find his men ready formed to meet us, my heart kept getting higher and higher until it felt to me as though it was in my throat. But he kept advancing. When they reached the hill, the Confederate camp was empty. Harris had fled at the first sign of Union approach. The Confederates had been as afraid as Grant was. And in that moment, Grant realized something crucial. In his memoirs, Grant recorded the realization. "I never forgot," he wrote, "that he had as much reason to fear my forces as I had his." The lesson was valuable. This was the insight that would define his entire military career. Fear was not weakness. Fear was universal. The enemy was just as afraid of him as he was of them. The difference was that Grant was willing to advance despite the fear. In February 1862, Grant was promoted to Major General. He was given command of the Army of the Tennessee, a growing force with a mission to break Confederate control of the western rivers. His first target, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The Fort Donelson assault was brutal. The Confederates fought hard. The terrain was difficult. Grant's men had to climb hills under fire, attack entrenched positions, maintain discipline under Confederate artillery. But they advanced. When the Confederate commander, General Simon Buckner, sent Grant a note requesting terms of surrender, Grant's response was simple and absolute. Unconditional surrender. Grant was born in that moment. Buckner surrendered. Over 21,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their weapons. The Union had its first major victory. But the Confederates had learned something dangerous. Grant was different from other Union generals. 3 months later, Grant faced his first major test when Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston attacked his army at Shiloh, Tennessee, catching them partially unprepared. The first day was catastrophic. Grant's forces were nearly driven back into the Tennessee River. His men were panicked, disorganized, dying by the hundreds. Many officers called for retreat, called for surrender, called for negotiations. Grant ignored all of it. Instead, he repositioned his lines. He rallied his officers. He organized a counterattack for the next day. When reinforcements arrived that night under General Don Carlos Buell, Grant was ready. On April 7th, Grant attacked. The Union forces drove the Confederates back across the same ground they had gained the day before. The Confederates retreated. It was a Union victory, but an ugly one. Nearly 24,000 casualties in 2 days. The bloodiest battle the continent had ever seen. The Northern press called him a butcher. Politically connected generals demanded his removal. Lincoln's advisers argued he was incompetent, reckless, dangerous. Lincoln refused to remove him. The president understood something that his advisers didn't. In a war of survival, a general who wasn't willing to fight was worse than a general who made mistakes. Grant's next target was Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city sat on the highest bluffs of the Mississippi River. It was the last Confederate stronghold on the river. Whoever controlled it controlled the waterway. The city was strongly fortified. The terrain was difficult. The Confederates had competent generals defending it. But Grant had an idea that made his entire command confused. He decided to cross the Mississippi River, the largest river in North America south of Vicksburg, then march inland to attack the city from behind. It meant leaving his supply lines behind. It meant operating in enemy territory with limited support. It meant doing something no general would have done if they were thinking like traditional military strategists. Grant's chief of staff, William Sherman, pulled him aside and told him the plan was too risky. Grant nodded, listened respectfully, and then did it anyway. In the space of 2 weeks, Grant's army crossed the Mississippi River, defeated and separated 2 Confederate armies, marched deeper into Mississippi, encircled Vicksburg, began the siege. The tempo of operations was shocking. Confederate commanders couldn't react fast enough. They were used to war moving at a measured pace, advance, entrench, wait for supplies, plan the next move. Grant moved like a man who understood something deeper. In war, speed is more valuable than perfection. The siege lasted 47 days. The Confederates inside were starving. The Union held the city surrounded. When it became clear that no relief force could reach them, the Confederate commander John Pemberton surrendered. On July 4, 1863, Independence Day, Vicksburg fell. The entire Mississippi River was now in Union hands. The Confederacy was literally cut in half. And Grant had done it not with overwhelming force, but with speed, maneuver, and the refusal to be paralyzed by fear. Confederate officers began writing about Grant in their correspondence. They called him relentless. They called him dangerous. They said he was different from other Union generals because he wouldn't stop. In the fall of 1863, a Federal force under General Rosecrans was trapped in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They were cut off, starving, facing Confederate lines that seemed unbreakable. Lincoln sent for Grant. Grant arrived and immediately reorganized the supply lines. He opened the Cracker Line, a route that allowed supplies to reach the trapped soldiers. Then he planned his assault. The Confederates held the high ground, Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. Both positions seemed impregnable. Grant attacked anyway. And in a moment that shocked both the Union and Confederacy, his men charged up Missionary Ridge, a massive incline that no one thought could be taken, and drove the Confederates off the summit. Chattanooga was secured. The gateway to the Deep South was open. By this point, Grant had won at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, and at Chattanooga. He had moved armies with unprecedented speed. He had defeated some of the Confederacy's best generals. And he had done it all while the Northern public was calling him a drunk, a butcher, a mediocre commander getting lucky. In March 1864, President Lincoln promoted Ulysses S. Grant to Lieutenant General, the first man to hold that rank since George Washington. Grant was given command of all Union armies. He moved east to face Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. This is the moment where the mythology of Lee as the brilliant general and Grant as the butcher was cemented in American consciousness. For the next year, Grant would fight Lee in a series of bloody battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Court House, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. Battles with enormous casualties. Battles where Grant's strategy seemed simple: attack, attack, attack. The Northern press crucified him. Anti-war elements in the North called him a murderer. Democratic politicians demanding he be replaced. But Lincoln held firm. Lincoln understood something that his detractors didn't. Grant was fighting a different war than previous Union commanders. Grant's key insight was this: the Confederacy could not win a war of attrition. The North had 22 million people. The South had 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were slaves not contributing to the war effort. Therefore, the only way the Union could lose was if it stopped fighting. Grant coordinated operations on all fronts. He had Sherman marching through Georgia while he fought Lee in Virginia. He kept the Confederacy under pressure everywhere, simultaneously, so they could never use interior lines of communication to shift forces to threatened areas. It was modern warfare, total war, and Confederate generals had no answer for it. General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted lieutenant, wrote in despair, "That man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of the war." General Joseph Johnston wrote, "His strategy is to hammer continuously with superior numbers until they yield." General Braxton Bragg wrote to Jefferson Davis that Grant was using warfare in a manner the Confederacy had no defense against. They were right. By the winter of 1864–65, the war was clearly lost for the Confederacy. But it wasn't lost because Grant was a brilliant strategist in the traditional sense. It was lost because Grant understood a fundamental truth about modern war, the side with the will to endure and the resources to sustain that will always wins eventually. The Confederacy was fighting Grant as if it could match the North in resources and manpower. It couldn't. Grant fought like a man who understood that asymmetry. By April 1865, Robert E. Lee's army was starving, exhausted, outnumbered 5-1. Grant had it surrounded at Appomattox Court House. Lee had no choice. He surrendered unconditionally. When Grant entered the room where Lee waited, he was wearing a simple blue uniform. No elaborate dress, no ceremonial sword, just a soldier meeting another soldier. In that moment, the Civil War was effectively over. In the years after the war, the mythology was rewritten. Robert E. Lee became the noble defender, the tragic hero, the brilliant general fighting against overwhelming odds. Grant became the drunk, the butcher, the man who won only because he had more men. But the Confederate generals who fought him never saw it that way. Let's be clear about why Confederate generals feared Grant. It wasn't because he was smarter than them in the traditional sense. Some of them, Lee in particular, had better formal military educations. It was 4 things. He had learned early that the enemy was just as afraid as he was. Instead of being paralyzed by that fear, he advanced anyway. Other generals, McClellan most famously, would see the enemy and imagine all the ways they could be defeated. Grant would see the enemy and think about ways to defeat them. General William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's closest ally, explained it this way: "I am a damned sight smarter man than Grant. I know a great deal more about war than he does. But he beats me because he don't care a damn for what the enemy does out of his sight, and it scares me like hell." Second, Grant understood logistics as warfare. Most generals thought of logistics as support for warfare. Grant thought of logistics as an offensive weapon. By controlling supply lines, he could control enemy movements. He could starve them out. He could force them to abandon positions because they couldn't be supplied. The Mississippi River Campaign was pure logistics warfare. Once Grant cut the Confederacy in half, the Western Confederate states couldn't support their armies. Third, Grant understood that speed prevented coordination. The Confederacy had interior lines of communication. They could move forces between theaters faster than the Union. But Grant didn't give them time to move. He attacked everywhere simultaneously, on multiple fronts, with relentless tempo. By the time the Confederates could respond to one threat, Grant had created another. This is why his campaign at Vicksburg shocked everyone. He moved so fast that Confederate generals couldn't believe what was happening. Fourth, Grant understood that the North couldn't lose if it didn't stop fighting. This is the insight that made him the general of total war. Lee was fighting as if it were possible for the South to win through brilliant tactics and strategy. Grant was fighting as if he simply needed to keep the pressure on until the Confederacy collapsed under the weight of manpower and resource superiority. It was not romantic, it was not a fair fight, but it was inevitable. By 1864-65, Grant looked exhausted. The casualty counts weighed on him. He never gloried in the killing. He hated war as much as he had hated it in Mexico, but he would not stop fighting. This was the quality that made Confederate generals fear him most. He was relentless in pursuit of victory. But here's what the mythology gets wrong. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Grant offered terms that were extraordinarily generous. Lee's soldiers could keep their horses. They would need them for plowing. They could keep their sidearms. They would not be prosecuted for treason. Grant treated the defeated Confederate general with respect. Grant never glorified the war, never celebrated the casualties. When his men started to fire a salute at the news of Lee's surrender, Grant immediately ordered it stopped. This was the contradiction at the heart of Grant. He was relentlessly, ruthlessly focused on winning, but he was not cruel about it. He understood war as something that had to be fought with total commitment. but also something to be ended with honor. After the war, Grant was celebrated as a hero, the man who saved the Union. He was eventually elected president, but his presidency was far less successful than his generalship. He was not a politician. He didn't understand political maneuvering. He was too trusting of men who wanted to use him for personal gain. In his final years, Grant lost most of his money to bad business ventures. He was sick with cancer. He was broke, but he wrote his memoirs. In those memoirs, Grant revealed the man behind the legend, a man who had struggled with fear but conquered it, a man who had failed in business but succeeded in warfare, a man who understood that victory required absolute commitment but also magnanimity toward the defeated. Grant died in 1885, having completed his memoirs just days before his death. What would Confederate generals have said about Grant's legacy? General Joseph Johnston: "I had no idea of the resources of Grant for offensive operations until that campaign at Vicksburg. He won my admiration." General James Longstreet: "He was a man of strong determination, iron will, clear head, and a readiness to assume responsibility. These are the elements of military success." General Braxton Bragg: "In Grant, we were dealing with a man who understood that modern war is not a gentleman's game. He understood what it takes to actually win." These were men who had fought against Grant, who had opposed him, who had tried to defeat him. Yet they all came to the same conclusion: Grant was different because he understood war differently, not as a gain to be won through brilliant maneuvers and clever tactics, but as a contest of wills where the side with the will to endure and the resources to maintain that endurance would prevail. In the end, what made Confederate generals fear Ulysses S. Grant was not his brilliance. It was his clarity. He saw the war plainly. He understood what had to be done. And he was willing to do it, regardless of cost, regardless of criticism, regardless of fear. That made him not a brilliant general, but an inevitable general. From a failed leather merchant to the general who saved the Union. From the man nobody wanted to lead to the man that terrified the Confederacy. From the drunk, the butcher, the mediocre commander to the only general who actually understood how to win modern war. Confederate generals feared Ulysses S. Grant because he showed them something they didn't want to see, that brilliance, that tactics, that the traditional art of war wasn't enough anymore. In the age of industrial warfare, with superior population and resources, the North didn't need a brilliant general. It needed a committed general. A general willing to attack on all fronts. A general who understood that speed and relentless pressure could prevent the enemy from ever recovering. Grant was that general. Ulysses S. Grant, the general the Confederacy feared most. Not because he was the greatest military mind of his generation, he wasn't, but because he was the first to understand that in modern war, will and resources matter more than brilliance, and he had both.